over the past several weeks, we've spent a lot of time talking about beliefs, identity, perception, and the stories we create about ourselves after painful experiences. We've talked about how beliefs are formed, why some experiences stay with us for years, and how the conclusions we reach can continue affecting us long after the experience itself has passed. But for this episode, I want to do something a little different. I want to revisit some of those same ideas, but through my personal story, because understanding something in theory and seeing what it looks like in a person's life are not always the same thing. Hello and welcome to Daring Woman. I'm Dr. Latasha Pinckney, and through my work, I help people better understand the experiences, beliefs, and perspectives that shape how they see themselves, others, and the world around them so they can move forward with greater clarity, awareness, and intention. Whether you've been here for a while or you're new here, welcome to the channel. Now let's get into it. Much of what we've been discussing throughout these episodes are some of the same themes I explored in my book, Still Becoming: Faith, Identity, and Healing When Life Changes Faster Than You're Ready. When I wrote that book, I wasn't simply trying to tell people what happened to me. I wanted to share what those experiences taught me to believe about myself, how those beliefs influenced my life, and some of the conclusions I carried for years. So for the next few conversations, I want to spend some time unpacking those stories, not because my experiences are unique, but because I suspect some of you may see parts of your own story in them. Our stories often shape us in ways we don't immediately recognize. Sometimes the beliefs that stay with us the longest can be traced back to experiences we didn't fully understand at the time. For example, what does rejection look like when it's no longer a concept but an experience? What does identity formation look like in real time? How do beliefs actually take root? And how do they begin influencing the way we see ourselves, other people, and the world around us? For me, there is one experience in particular that influenced far more of my life than I could have ever understood at the time. I've shared this story before, and I'm sharing it again, not because I haven't moved beyond it, but because the belief that came out of it influenced my life for many years afterward. And if we're going to understand the belief that shaped so much of what followed, we first have to return to the moment where it began. I've mentioned before that the year I turned 8 marked a turning point in my life. I had just completed second grade and was enjoying the freedom of summer, completely unaware that my life was about to change. During that time, I lived with my grandmother, my mother's mother, my aunt, and her 4 children, who were more like siblings to me than cousins. My grandmother was the matriarch of the family, and her role in my life was always clear. She was my grandmother. The role of my aunt, however, was much less clear. Because my mother did not live in the home, and because my grandmother and aunt cared for me daily, I assumed my aunt was my mother too. Of course, no one ever told me that. It was simply the explanation that made the most sense to me at the time based on what I saw and experienced every day. That summer in particular, after my cousin and I had gotten into one of our usual disagreements, my aunt abruptly sent me to a neighbor's house, and I thought nothing of it. In our small community, everyone felt like family, so my being sent to one of the neighbors' houses meant nothing. I spent the day moving from one house to the next, playing and enjoying summer the way children do, completely unaware of what awaited me. But when I returned home that evening, something was different. The house was eerily quiet. I remember moving from room to room, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Panic set in as I realized that all of my aunts' and cousins' things were gone. Then I saw my grandmother lying on the bed crying, and it was at that moment I knew they weren't coming back. So I went and sat on the sofa and just cried. My grandmother was so consumed by her own grief that she didn't notice mine, so there was no one there to help me understand what was happening. Even now, I can still see that little girl sitting on the sofa crying. To understand why I would come to believe what I did, you have to understand how I saw the world at 8 years old. During that period of my life, neither my parents lived in the home. Although my mother visited often and remained actively involved, my grandmother and aunt were the people responsible for me daily. And because my aunt had children of her own, my cousins, in my mind, she was my mother too. So when she left, I wasn't simply trying to understand why my aunt was gone. I was trying to understand why yet another important person in my life was absent. In the mind of an 8-year-old, I became the common denominator in all of those absences. If my father wasn't there, if my mother wasn't there, and now my aunt was gone too, then perhaps the problem wasn't with them. Perhaps the problem was with me. It was then that I heard the words, "No one loves you." Now, those words weren't audible. No one actually said them. But in that moment, that's what I believed. Of course, that belief wasn't true, but to an 8-year-old who didn't have the tools to understand, it was simply the one that made the most sense. One of the things I've learned over the years is just how powerful our early experiences can be, even long after the event itself has passed. In his book, The Body Keeps Score, Bessel van der Kolk explains that the body remembers what the mind may later try to forget. And I have found that to be true in my own life because even now, decades later, I can revisit that moment and still feel the emotional weight of it. Now, I see that experience differently now, but I haven't forgotten what it felt like. For years, I thought the only significant part of that day was losing my aunt. What I didn't understand at the time was that the belief that formed as a result of her leaving would affect my life just as much as her leaving did. I suspect many of us have experienced something similar. Not through the exact same circumstances, of course, but through experiences that left us confused, hurt, disappointed, rejected, abandoned, or struggling to understand what was happening around us. Even with limited information and understanding, we drew conclusions about ourselves, and in many cases, those conclusions remained with us far longer than the event that produced them. For me, that conclusion was the belief that I was unloved. As a child, before I ever struggled with feelings of inadequacy, I struggled with the misguided belief that I was unloved and in some instances unlovable. For many years, I convinced myself that this was true. And because of that belief, I often kept people at a distance. If no one loved me, then keeping others at arm's length felt safer than risking the pain of actual rejection. At one point, that belief served its purpose. It allowed me to control how close anyone could get. What I did not understand was that the same walls protecting me from hurt were also preventing genuine connection. Rejection works this way. It causes us to believe we are not accepted. And once that belief begins taking root, it influences how we relate to others, what we expect from relationships, and how we understand ourselves. It took me years to let go of that belief because it influenced what I expected from other people and from life itself. Believing I was unloved became for me what the Apostle Paul described in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, 7 through 10, as a thorn in the flesh, something I wrestled with well into adulthood. The reason I wanted to bring this story up again isn't that I'm still living in that moment. It's because understanding where that belief came from helped me understand why it had so much influence over my life for so many years. It helped me understand why I was often skeptical of people's intentions and why it was sometimes difficult to believe that people genuinely cared about me. What I didn't realize was that a lot of what I viewed as independence or even self-protection was actually connected to that belief I'd been carrying for years. The truth is, sometimes we spend years trying to change what we're doing without ever asking ourselves why we're doing it in the first place. We focus on what we may be afraid of, the patterns that seem to keep showing up in our lives, and the struggles we can't seem to move past, but we rarely stop to consider where those things came from. The good news is, however, that just because we've believed something for years doesn't mean we have to keep on believing it. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, Paul instructs us to take every thought captive and to make it obedient to Christ. Now, although Paul is speaking about our thoughts, what are beliefs if not thoughts we've returned to over and over again? Thoughts we've replayed, wrestled with, and accepted as true until they became deeply embedded within us. At some point, they stop being just thoughts. They become the assumptions quietly guiding how we see ourselves, other people, and the world around us. And that's why it's important to pay attention to what it is we're believing. We shouldn't automatically accept a belief as true simply because we've held it for a long time. Sometimes we need to take a closer look at what we believe and ask ourselves whether it's true. You know, my hope in all of this is that sharing my story encourages you to spend some time thinking about your own experiences, the beliefs you may have formed because of them, and whether those beliefs are still influencing your life today. As you think about those experiences, consider this. What conclusions did you arrive at about yourself during moments of disappointment, loss, rejection, or pain? Are those conclusions actually true? Or are they explanations you created while trying to make sense of something you didn't fully understand at the time? You know what comes next. If these conversations resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and be sure to like and share so that they reach others who may need them. As always, thank you for joining me. And until next time, keep reflecting, keep growing, and remember that sometimes the most powerful shifts in perspective begin with a single question.